Thank you very much, and I appreciate your patience with me. I've got multiple committee assignments that are pulling me in 3 different directions. I may have to leave later for another committee hearing, but bear with us on that. Ms. McGregor, I'd like to start with you. The nationwide housing shortage is something that some states are experiencing more than others. We experience it to a particularly acute degree in the West and in my home state of Utah, where the federal government owns 2/3 of the land. And that severely restricts the housing supply. Now, there's a law in the books, like the Recreation and Public Purposes Act, that authorizes the Department of the Interior to lease or convey federal land for public purposes. Under the law, a public purpose is defined as, quote, for the purpose of providing facilities or services for the benefit of the public in connection with, but not limited to, public health, safety, or welfare. In your view, could housing be considered a public purpose for purposes of the Recreation and Public Purposes Act?
Sir, I think it could.
And in the event that it couldn't, recognizing that some might see it differently, or to address any ambiguity, I've introduced legislation called the Houses Act, which follows the template of the Recreation and Public Purposes Act to independently allow for that. Now, I was pleased to see recently that there was this announced partnership between the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of the Interior to address housing affordability in the West. Any idea what actions the Department of Interior could take to help tackle the housing crisis?
Well, sir, I first want to say that we would love to work with you on that endeavor, and I know that for technical assistance, we offer it to every member of the committee when it comes to drafting legislative ideas that are creative, and I know housing has been a big issue, not just in the West, throughout our country. And I recall, working on this in the first Trump administration with particular attention to Park Service employees, because housing for Park Service employees tends to be one of the greatest obstacles to get that workforce out into these very rural or sometimes difficult or maybe more expensive areas so that we can have the workforce we need to keep our parks open. But when it comes to some of the opportunities there, I think, the RMPP Act has some issues with it. For instance, the reversionary clauses can be difficult and tie up potential home ownership with the full transference of land. I think when people think about owning a home, they believe it belongs to them and that the land is theirs, not that it could be pulled back by the federal government or by a township based upon not fulfilling the needs of the act in its original statutory form. So I think working on that, working on environmental reviews and efficiency will actually help make better use of that act.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and it's one of the reasons why in the Houses Act we deal with that by leaving a short reversionary interest for a period of 15 years just to make sure that it remains in use as single-family housing during that duration. Once that 15-year period is elapsed, the reversionary interest goes away. Mr. Danley, let's turn to you for a moment. President Trump seeks to attack and limit the waste, fraud, and abuse occurring within the U.S. government. In any government spending, $7.2, $7.3 trillion a year, the crumbs that fall from that table are going to be pretty large, and it leaves room for people to make mistakes along the way. But some of those mistakes end up being very big and very costly. Recently, a number of projects, grants, and contracts that were mandated by law, such as the laws like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, have been exposed as problematic in one way or another, unnecessary, duplicative, or otherwise an issue. For example, the Department of Energy recently canceled a $247 million contract for appliance standards. If confirmed, how will you commit to working with Congress to make sure that DOE isn't frivolously spending taxpayer dollars or spending taxpayer dollars on unnecessary, duplicative, or wasteful projects?
Thank you, Senator Lee. Every government agency head and all of their subordinate officers are required to stop waste, fraud, and abuse wherever it's found. Every contract that the government signs and every set of funds that the government commits has to be done in accordance with the law, in accordance to the preconditions established by the agency's regulations, and the terms of the contract have to be honored. This is everything from the basic predicate requirements for the contract to the milestones and conditions. President Trump has outlined a very bold vision for reducing waste in federal government spending, and I am absolutely dedicated to the same purpose. It is the only way to properly steward the taxpayers' money, and government should constantly be on the lookout for ways to find greater efficiencies.
And strictly speaking, outside the context of its own branch, neither the legislative branch nor the judicial branch is typically a contracting agency. In other words, contracts may be entered into within the legislative branch for the legislative branch or within the judicial branch, likewise, for the judiciary. But typically for the government generally, contract decisions, overseeing the performance of a contract, entering into the contract, signing the contract, even in some circumstances anticipatorily repudiating a contract for reasons deemed necessary and appropriate by the executive. Those are executive decisions, not legislative or judicial ones typically. Is that right?
Of course it is. And not only does every branch have their own obligations, the executive branch spending, I don't know what the percentage is, but 99.99% of the money in contracts from the government has obviously a much weightier duty to ensure that those dollars are spent properly. And you know, there are efficiencies not just in the way that government conducts its business through contracting, but in the ways that the contracts are awarded and in the types of solicitations that the government undertakes. It is a fundamental problem, and there is a huge amount of money that's spent that doesn't need to be.
Thank you.